I am honored to be joined today by three stellar C-level executives, Jeff Lund, Steve Williams, and Greg Simpson. Jeff, Steve, and Greg, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Lisa.
Glad to be here.
So, Greg, you have an interesting concept of diminishing circles of trust. Would you mind talking us through that?
Well, I think the simple way to think about it is start with the printer. A printer has a really large circle of trust because a lot of end user devices, a lot of people need to be able to connect to the printer to make it effective, right? But you've got to think about your crown jewels. You don't want your crown jewels to have the same circle of trust as your printer. You want that to have a much smaller circle of trust. And you've got to define that circle of trust for really all your assets, because you can't really have zero trust. Zero trust means you don't trust anybody. You're not going to get anything done. So you've got to figure out what's the right size circle of trust for your particular device or server or end user. And it's easy to talk about crown jewels and how they need the least amount of trust. It's sort of like the old concept of least privileged access, right? That's not a new concept, but we've learned that people are going to keep clicking phishing links. We've been trying to stop them from doing it for years. No matter what we do, they continue to click. So we've got to be able to control what their machine can get to. It's not a matter of not trusting the end user. It's just a matter of if that machine gets infected, we're at risk. And that lateral movement of that ransomware is a bad thing. So I think understanding your circles of trust and how you delineate those is similar to understanding your levels of access, least privileged access. And companies have always struggled with balancing their users' desire to access everything. And the reality is we can't give their endpoints access to everything without putting our companies at risk.
Absolutely. Jeff or Steve, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just one, I think it's a very interesting concept, especially when you start thinking about how to segment appropriately, your business and what's important or not. One of the challenges I think we have at Marsh & McLennan is identifying what those crown jewels are, what really are those important items. And it kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask the app owner, their app is the most critical thing on the planet. But obviously, if you ask, the CEO of that particular business, they have a very different perspective. So I don't know, maybe the printer is really important to, this one person.
Totally.
And I think this is kind of a marketing misnomer, if you will, the idea of zero trust, because to Greg's point, you don't have the ability to do zero trust and do business. That's just, those two things do not go hand in hand. So for a CXO, this is really more about finding the kind of the appropriate level of trust. If you wanted to stick to zero trust, it's more of a zero kind of implied trust from a term perspective more than anything else. I would say the other piece to think through, in addition to kind of knowing your business, knowing those crown jewels, is also being comfortable with the idea of moving away from moment in time assessments of security and going towards more of a dynamic thing. Every transaction, reasonably speaking, should and could be inspected for its risk. And I think that's really where we need to start looking for our technology partners and just our general business processes to start adapting into that mindset.
Completely agree. And I'm totally with you on zero implicit trust. We all have to trust someone or something. So Greg, I'll come back to you. How do you know where to focus your energy when it comes to protecting against ransomware?
I'm a big believer in back to basics. I think a lot of the attacks we've seen get in because of really basic fundamental security issues. So my advice to companies is always go back to basics. Do you have the proper passwords in place? Do you have the proper controls in place? So there's a lot of fundamental things you got to make sure you've shored up. And do you have a strategy? Do you have a zero trust platform that you're building on? You can start small and work your way up to take that strategy out across your infrastructure. But I think the simplest thing people can do is go back to the basics and make sure that they're really doing those very well. Because if you look at the types of attack we see, it's often because the door was wide open. So, you got to make sure all your doors are locked first, and then go around and secure your windows, and then go around and, check the chimneys and secure your house, but start with the biggest risk areas first and make sure that they're well secured.
Certainly. Steve, Jeff, thoughts?
Yeah, just real quick. I think as companies started their own digital transformations, whether it was pandemic induced or just because it was the right time for their business. We saw a lot of people pivot off to cloud or pivot to a different way of doing business. And I think one of those kind of absolutely echoing statements around, are you doing your core basic blocking and tackling, to use a US metaphor? Are you doing that well? Part of that is because you're doing business differently. And sometimes it's very easy to forget. Sometimes it's because you're taking an assumption that a vendor is doing something for you in the shared responsibility world of the cloud. And the other aspect is you're also now changing the way that you have secured or operated some of those controls. As you move to cloud, I'm now, whether you want to do DevSecOps or Agile or DevSecOps or pick your favorite term, I'm asking people to employ a different skill set than they ever have before. I'm asking probably a classic app dev person, hey, can you also figure out how to do this firewall or network security group or whatever? And they have no idea. It's not because they want to do the wrong thing. We just haven't properly skilled those resources. So to me, it's kind of a do the basics, but also make sure you're properly skilling and kind of updating your people so they're capable of doing the job the way you now want them to do it.
Completely. Jeff, what about automation and integration? How do those play in here?
Actually, I think that plays sort of very well in building upon, both what Greg and Steve have been talking about. But, I don't think there's sort of one particular or one single answer, if you will. Automation is a huge piece because it helps in your sort of automating the detection at the speed at which, the network is running, right? So if your SOAR tools are tuned along with your SIM to understand your adversary, understand those tactics that they're using to attack, build your automation around identifying those in your environment. So, prioritize sort of the detection capabilities, of your, sort of your cyber program. My thinking is a little bit more along the lines of sort of what Teresa was mentioning around, know your adversary. And if you build your program and detection capabilities and prevention tools like, EDRs and SIMs and all this sort of thing around, sort of those tactics that the bad guys are using, you're going to dramatically increase your chance of identifying and possibly preventing, that issue from even occurring.
That sounds like
the other thing Teresa said was that AI is at risk in the sense that it can start to do things like campaigns. And I think, we've got to make sure we're harnessing AI to look at anomalous behaviors and start to understand what kind of traffic do we expect to see on our networks, so that, we've got to use the same tools the bad guys are using to up the security game so that we can detect things sooner, better, faster. And we've got to have all the disciplines, detection, response, prevention, all the different disciplines of security. You can't rely on just one.
There's no silver bullet, right?
Right.
Certainly. So Steve, how do you ensure that your plans around ransomware translate effectively from theory to practice? What do you do there?
I think for two aspects here, and I'll quote the great 20th century philosopher Mike Tyson, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And I think cybersecurity, we heard it before, it's warfare, pick your favorite thing. It's a combat sport, period. And so people have to move away from the traditional, almost BCP DR mindset of paper exercises and tabletop exercises are sufficient. Yeah, sure, you should absolutely do those. They're not wasted time, but you shouldn't stop there anymore. I think the biggest part is, how do you figure out what your landscape is? How do you decide that you want to act? And like Raymark was talking about, this is not a time for consensus. When you're involved in a contact sport like an incident, you cannot rule by consensus. This is going to have to be directed activity, which means, just like any other sport, you better practice it, you better know who to call, and you better know who you're getting a call from. So I think that kind of mentality of training, building the muscle memory, and actually inflicting some harm, as strange as that is as a mindset, but inflicting some level of harm to your company so you know how you will react, is incredibly important. I think the other part is, bad guys are awesome at sharing information. They share it at lightning speed. They have no shame at all in terms of, here's what I attacked this company with. It kind of worked, but I got caught. The next person figures out how to get around it. They keep monetizing and they share actively. Unfortunately, in the good guy side of the community, we do a miserable job with that. Part of it's because of the idea of, I'll just call it cyber shaming. we're so afraid of admitting, oh, geez, I had a vulnerability, I had a problem, that we're unwilling to talk about it. We're unwilling to share solutions. We're unwilling to even go to vendors like Zscaler to say, I have this issue, can you help? Or it'd be awesome if this could now do this other thing, because I've built some battle scars and tissue. I need help. I need a different answer than what we have today. And so I think until we address those two pieces, both kind of the training aspect from a muscle memory, as well as really talking about the issues and how do we want to get better as a community, the bad guys, unfortunately, are going to have the upper hand.
And I would say that's an area where building communities like the CXO Revolutionaries Forum, even having the hallway track at conferences, once we get back to in-person conferences, the ability to network and to connect with each other becomes so critical. Layer 8 can be as important as the technical aspects of this.
Oh, definitely.
Jeff, what about you? What would your approach be?
Actually, mine would be very similar to sort of the idea that Steve was presenting. I would really even add on and double down on the information sharing, sharing piece, and that goes within an organization and certainly between organizations. We get caught up sometimes of I don't know, an audit or a risk assessment identifies some weakness, and that idea of cyber shaming, Steve, that you mentioned is sort of what comes to mind. Immediately it's, well, I didn't mean that, or they really think that we're sort of after them personally for this sort of issue, and that's really not the case, right? We want to be able to collaborate with our our IT partners and network teams and desktop support teams and closing the gaps. That's really the interest. But I think if we can get past that cyber shaming, and kind of going back to maybe what Greg was saying around get back to the basics, do that well. If we get past that cyber shaming component of doing that piece well, it actually would be a very big win.
Yeah. And, Greg, you mentioned the users have their own interests. How do you balance the requests from your users with the need to lock down access?
I think one of the things you could do is try to figure out solutions for what they really want. Often the users ask for things that they don't really need because they're trying to accomplish some specific goal. So you just have to, instead of, they come and say, hey, I need access to all this. Well, what do you really need? Well, I need this report on a daily basis. Well, we can get you that report on a daily basis. We don't have to give you access to the whole world to do that, right? So trying to understand what the users really want, because you want to enable the users to do their job. Because if you don't, they're going to try to find ways around you to do it anyway, right? So you want to figure out what is the job they're trying to do and then enable that job for them without enabling everything else. So I think it comes down to really communicating, understanding their needs, educating them on why you can't do certain things. Hey, we can't do this because of these problems and these security issues. And this is the kind of things you're going to see. And if you have that good dialogue, it's kind of like building trust. Once they trust you, you trust them. There's a give and take, and you can work through it with your users.
I almost find that there's some value in the annoying toddler school of exploration. I want to do X. Why? Well, I'm trying to accomplish this. Why? Well, we really have to fix this problem. Why? And eventually you get through the whys and down to the true goal there.
Exactly.
There's a great question from the audience. Does anyone have thoughts on focusing on availability versus recovery? They're all about designing in availability versus creating recovery strategies, process, and policies. Open round.
Yeah, I think building resiliency is critical. I think we are now in a culture where availability is 24/7 is the goal. So you've got to have really resilient systems, and designing resilient systems changes your whole model around DR planning, right? So you still have a DR plan, but your DR plan is built around having resilient systems that can work, when the other one's down, and can continue to keep things up and running. And it's a little different than the old DR model of, okay, everything's down, we stop, we reload everything over here, we start all over again. It's got to be, you don't have the hours to do that anymore. You've got milliseconds to recover to a new safe zone that's completely isolated. So I think the changing that mindset to resiliency is important. And to go back to something Steve said earlier, you got to practice to get that muscle memory.
Totally. Steve,
I think Yeah, well, just building upon that, that really requires a strong design and strong architecture. When you're putting those systems in play, many times, especially maybe in financial services, it's about being agile. It's about speed to market. It's about satisfying that client requirement. And sometimes the design piece just doesn't happen to the extent that all of us would prefer. So you almost have to sort of go slow to go fast in that case, right? Like stand back and really focus on that architecture that accounts for resiliency and availability. It's a huge tenet, right? But it takes time to do that right. But if you do it right, you can now do sort of the fast recovery, or really focus on that high availability component that's necessary.
Yes.
And I think the other portion here is societally, we've become a little accustomed to a now baby type of scenario, whether it's Amazon delivering with lightning speed to my doorstep or whatever. We get a little spoiled with everything being fairly immediate. And there's still some technical challenges, laws of physics, et cetera, that you're never going to have that perfect scenario. If I cut the transatlantic cable, bad things are going to happen. It's going to take a while to recover. And I think some of that is also customer expectation setting, board expectation setting, to make sure there will be scenarios where no amount of resiliency and no amount of dollars will buy you a zero impact or even low impact space. It's just like any other risk management. Make sure you understand what you're willing to protect, how much you're willing to spend to protect it. And then everything else is going to be the kind of elephant in the room of bad things are going to happen. We're just going to have to accept the risk and deal with it when it comes.
Yep. Jeff, you talked about information sharing. Audience question, do the legal aspects get in the way of that sharing? They see that it is a problem. How do you address that?
Yeah, sometimes it is. I mean, there's plenty of bits of information that are, client attorney privileged data that really can't be shared. But I do find that there are a number of really good forums in which you could share, information under a TLP red or amber sort of, scenario. And in those cases, I would encourage participation there. Even though you may not be able to share a particular detail that is sort of legal privileged, the input perhaps into that, the metadata around that information, you can share within guidelines, and oftentimes that's enough to get people thinking about, hey, this is something I need to pay attention to.
Certainly. Greg, how does the supply chain affect this? How far do you go?
Yeah, it's difficult because companies are becoming more and more interdependent particularly as they become more cloud-based. So you start to become more dependent on more providers and other tools that are in the cloud. So you see you're basically you're expanding that circle of trust out to a lot more people, a lot more things. And you really have to consider that as you think about your security strategy, because that any one of those supply chain partners that you're working with could be a door into your company if you don't have the right controls and trust parameters around how you trust that vendor and what they do. So I think you've got to treat them almost like they're the same way you treat your employees and your data center. You've got to think about how do we contain and control their access, and what's the circle we're going to draw around them, and how tight's it going to be.
Right. And, third party risk isn't just third party, it's third party and fourth party and fifth party. I was in a CXO roundtable in San Francisco before the pandemic, and one of the gentlemen there said it's a fractal. It just keeps going. So last question, Steve, what's the simplest thing a CXO can do today to improve your ransomware protection?
I think it comes down to kind of, a three-step program in my mind. This is like see it, manage it, secure it. I have to see something before I can manage it. I have to manage it before I can secure it. And I think visibility is still lacking for most companies. Like just from an honest perspective, how many people really understand what their internet surface looks like, how many assets they have, where they're at, et cetera. I think as an industry, getting to the point where you have the right kind of visibility so that you can establish management based on whatever your business appetite is, then ultimately secure it based on your risk tolerance and risk appetite, that would be I would say the order of operations that I would look for. So as you're making investment calls, as you're thinking of what comes next year in your financial plan, I'd strongly encourage people to make sure, level best, do you have the right visibility? If so, move to management. If so, move to security.
So visibility is ground zero. Jeff, what about for you? Simplest thing?
Yeah, simple thing is know your adversary. I talked about the threat intelligence component. Certainly know where you have exposure as a sort of the second item, and lastly, awareness. Educate your users. Right, they oftentimes are your front line.
Awesome. And Greg, final words, simplest thing?
I'd say take the basic strategy of monitor, detect, respond, and then apply the new learnings to each of those categories. Like, for example, in monitoring, use AI to get better at understanding anomalies versus traditional monitoring. So take each one of your basic models that you've used, whatever your model is, and try to expand it with the latest and greatest new technologies to make it better.
Hey, thank you, but really appreciate all of your candid insights today, Jeff, Steve, and Greg.